Think back to January 5th, 1996. Across the eastern seaboard, from Maine to Florida, millions of people were doing what they always did on a winter morning. They were brewing coffee, checking the forecast one last time before heading out, making plans for the weekend that for once seemed completely ordinary. In Philadelphia, a man named Robert was driving his daughter to school. The sky was gray, sure, but nothing he hadn't seen 100 times before. In North Carolina, a woman named Sarah was stocking shelves at a grocery store, listening to customers joke about how the weatherman keeps crying wolf. And in New York City, a transit worker named Marcus was clocking in for his shift at the subway depot, ready for another Friday. None of them knew what was coming. This is the story of the blizzard of 1996, the storm that would paralyze the entire eastern United States and remind a modern connected world how quickly civilization depends on systems we barely notice until they fail. And if you love stories like this, the ones about nature, survival, and what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstance, please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers. Now, let's go back to that Friday morning. By dawn on Saturday, January 6th, the first real signs were there. The sky wasn't just grey anymore. It was closing in, pressing down like a wool blanket pulled tight. The wind had teeth to it, that kind of wind that makes you squint and lean forward just to walk. Robert's daughter asked if school would be cancelled. He told her probably not. The forecasters had warned of snow. Yes, but major winter storm was what they always said. In his experience, that meant 2 inches and an excuse to leave work early. He listened to the radio as he drove. The warnings were getting louder, but warnings always were. Sarah had worked grocery stores through plenty of winters. She'd seen the panic buying before. People filling carts with milk and bread like the snow was coming to swallow civilization. This storm felt different somehow, but she told herself to stay calm. The weatherman was probably exaggerating. They usually did. Marcus arrived at the transit depot and looked at the schedule. Buses and trains were supposed to run normally. The MTA knew how to handle snow. The subway didn't care about the weather anyway. It ran underneath it all, safe in the tunnels. He had no idea that within hours, those tunnels would become tombs of trapped air and anxiety, filled with thousands of people going nowhere. The thing about the winter of 1996 is that people felt like they understood it. Meteorology was advanced. Forecasts had gotten better. We had radar, satellites, computer models. A storm couldn't really surprise us anymore. It could be inconvenient, sure, but dangerous. In the modern age, most people didn't think that way anymore. They were about to learn otherwise. By Saturday afternoon, the snow wasn't falling. It was being shot sideways by winds that felt like they had intention. Gusts hit 35, then 40 miles per hour. The temperature had started dropping. Robert listened to the radio as he bought emergency supplies, bread, milk, canned goods, and realized with sudden clarity that maybe this wasn't normal after all. The announcer's voice had changed. It wasn't the usual calm. There was an edge to it now. Sarah's grocery store was becoming chaotic. The milk section was picked clean. The bread aisle was a war zone. People were buying with the desperate energy of those who suddenly understood something terrible was about to happen. Managers were already calling in extra staff, but it didn't matter. The snow was coming too fast. By evening, the temperature had plummeted. It was 10 degrees, then 5, then below 0. The snow accumulated at a rate nobody had quite anticipated. An inch every hour, then faster. In some places, visibility dropped to just a few feet. You couldn't see the next car. You couldn't see the streetlight. You could only see white, moving, alive. The highways started clogging around 8 p.m. Hundreds of cars slowed to crawls. Thousands. People who had left for Friday afternoon were now trapped in metallic ribbons of traffic that barely moved. Exits were being closed. The authorities were asking people to stay off the roads, but by then thousands were already out there. By 11 p.m. the power started failing, not everywhere at once, but in pockets across Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, New York. The lines were coming down. The weight of ice and snow on the cables was simply too much. The grid that carried electricity to millions of homes began shutting itself down in cascades. Neighborhoods went dark. Traffic lights died. Gas stations went silent. Marcus's subway train got stuck around midnight. Not in a tunnel, actually between stations in the frozen darkness, with 200 people on board who suddenly had no ventilation, no movement, no idea how long they would be there. The announcement came through the speakers, crackling and strange. "We apologize for the delay. We are investigating the situation." The woman next to Marcus, whose name was Linda, started crying quietly. Her daughter was home alone, waiting for her. The roads were becoming parking lots and death traps simultaneously. Robert had made it about 40 miles from home when he pulled into a truck stop and parked, realizing that trying to drive further was suicide. The snow was so heavy he couldn't see the hood of his truck. The wind was rocking the cab. He sat there in the darkness and called his wife. "I'm not coming home tonight," he said. "It's not safe." By 3 in the morning, the eastern seaboard was fractured. Not just snowed in, fractured. The systems that held modern life together, power, transportation, on their communication, were failing in sequence like dominoes. The coldest hours came between 3 a.m. and dawn. The temperature in most places hit 20 to 30 below zero. With the wind chill felt like 50 below in some areas. In the darkness, in the cold, in the silence that came when the power died, people experienced something most modern Americans had never felt: true isolation. In her car on I-95 in Maryland, a woman named Diane was running out of gas. She had stayed home as long as she could, but by morning she had needed to get to her mother's house in Virginia. The forecast said she could make it. It was supposed to be 2 hours. She had been driving for 6. Her battery was dying. Her heat was dying. The snow pressed against the windows. She sat in the darkness and made a choice. She could keep the car running to preserve heat, but that would burn through her remaining gas faster. Or she could shut it off and preserve fuel, but face the cold. She chose the cold. She shut the engine off, wrapped herself in blankets from her trunk, and waited. The silence outside was absolute. The snow was still coming down, still completely obscuring the outside world. In Philadelphia, Robert sat in the truck stop with dozens of other stranded drivers. Nobody was quite sure how long this would last. The radio said the storm was the largest to hit the East Coast in decades. One driver, an older man who had been trucking for 40 years, said he had never seen anything like it. The food at the truck stop was running low. Some people were rationing coffee. Marcus, in the subway car, had been sitting in that same spot for 3 hours now. The emergency lights ran on batteries and were starting to dim. Somebody had smashed the window between cars to allow airflow. People were standing closer together for warmth. Linda was still crying, but quietly now, as if she had made peace with the fact that her daughter would have to fend for herself tonight. A man across the aisle was holding her hand. She didn't know his name. It didn't matter. The hospitals were running on backup generators. Emergency rooms were filling with frostbite cases, heart attacks, some from shoveling snow, some from the stress of the crisis itself. Ambulances were taking 2 hours to traverse distances that usually took 5 minutes. Roads that existed that morning no longer existed. They had become featureless white expanses where direction was purely a matter of guess. In North Carolina, Sarah's grocery store had become a makeshift emergency shelter. The power had gone out around 2 a.m., but there were cots in the back office, and there was food, and there was heat from the industrial ovens in the deli. 47 people had ended up staying overnight. Stranded customers, people who worked there, people who had wandered in from the streets. They shared meals. They told each other their names. In another era, it would have been called a refugee camp. In 1996, it was just what you did when the system failed. You helped each other survive. By dawn on Sunday, the snow had stopped. The wind had eased. What remained was a landscape that looked post-apocalyptic. Over 2 feet of snow in many places. Some areas had accumulated 3 feet. Roads were completely impassable. Airports were closed. The entire eastern seaboard was isolated. But something extraordinary happened in that isolation. On Sunday morning, when the roads were technically still impassable, but people had survived the worst of the night, neighbors started digging out. Not just their own driveways, everybody's. Marcus finally made it off the subway train. They had managed to push it back to the last station, and he walked home through 2 feet of snow. And the first thing he did was shovel the entire street outside his building. He remembered watching people shoveling. That image stayed with him forever. Robert at the truck stop helped organize food rationing and made sure the youngest people and the oldest people ate first. He coordinated with the state police, who used the truck stop as a base to get stranded drivers to shelter. People remember the truck stop driver who turned his establishment into a triage center. People remember his name was something like Joe, and he never asked for payment. In Philadelphia, Diane managed to run her car enough to keep warm through the night without dying. By Sunday morning, she was alive. She walked for 3 hours through the snow to a farmhouse, where the family inside took her in without hesitation. They gave her food. They let her use their landline to call her mother. They didn't know her. It didn't matter. Sarah stayed at the grocery store through the whole storm. By Sunday, she was exhausted, but she was also the center of something important. 47 people had survived because that building existed, and because she had stayed. The manager drove in late Sunday afternoon. The roads were barely passable, and she asked him what they owed the landlord for the heat, the cots, the deli ovens. He said, "Nothing, do you understand? Nothing. This is what community is." The stories multiplied. Farmers were rescuing stranded motorists from their barns. Churches opened their doors. Bars became warming centers. In one town in upstate New York, a small grocery actually ran a shuttle operation. They would go out into the snow with snowmobiles and bring people back to the store to shelter. A woman who ran a motel in Virginia opened her doors to 30 strangers for 2 days and turned away payment. People remember the moment when the snow stopped and the sun came out, and it was the most beautiful blue sky you've ever seen because you had just survived something. People remember the silence. People remember the weight of understanding that all the modern infrastructure, all the highways, the power lines, the grid, could fail, and what would remain is just human beings helping human beings. By the time the roads cleared, and it took days of round-the-clock plowing, the damage was staggering. Over 150 people had died, either directly from the cold or from complications of the storm. The economic impact was in the billions. For several days, the entire eastern seaboard, the most populated and economically productive region of the country, had simply stopped functioning. But something shifted after that storm. The Weather Service completely overhauled how they communicated warnings. After 1996, when they said blizzard, people listened. Meteorologists learned that they had to be more dramatic, more direct, more honest about catastrophic risk. The entire warning system evolved because of that storm. Emergency management protocols changed. Agencies started thinking seriously about cascading failures. What happens when power fails? When roads fail? When communication fails? They invested in backup systems. They drilled for the scenario. They understood that a single storm could unwind the entire system if they weren't prepared, and the people who lived through it changed too. Robert became someone who kept supplies ready every winter, not in a paranoid way, in a humble way. He understood that you cannot control nature. You can only prepare. Sarah left the grocery store industry after that winter. She became an emergency management coordinator. She spent 20 years helping communities prepare for disasters. She trained people on evacuation protocols, shelter management, supply chain resilience. She was shaped by that single storm into a lifetime of service. Marcus never complained about a delayed subway again. He understood something about infrastructure, how fragile it was, how many people it took to maintain it, how quickly it could fail. When the 2003 blackout hit the Northeast, years later, he was one of the people helping coordinate emergency response in the subway system. That storm made him see his job differently. But the deepest legacy wasn't about systems or protocols. It was about memory. It wasn't just a blizzard. It was a reminder that we are all closer to catastrophe than we think. It wasn't just about snow falling. It was about what you do when everything stops, when the power dies, when the roads close, when isolation becomes total. You help your neighbor. You share your food, you remember their name. The blizzard of 1996 didn't change the climate or alter history books, but it changed the people who lived through it. It changed how an entire region thought about preparedness, about community, about vulnerability. And those changes, quiet as they were, rippled forward into thousands of small decisions that saved lives in future storms. Thank you so much for watching. If you have memories of the blizzard of 1996 or any other storm that changed you, please share them in the comments below. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.